I will sing of the Mormons, the people of the Lord, since the time that Joseph prayed for life, and the way they've been guided by Jesus' holy words, and praised by the fire of his might. The grasshoppers, crickets, and mobbers all combined were powerless to crush our noble cause. The more we are hated, the more we are maligned, the more the Church of Jesus grows. 'Tis the song, the sigh of the Mormons. Hard times, long oppressed us sore. Many days they have lingered around our cabin door, but now we've brighter days in store. 'Tis the song, the sigh of the Mormons. Hard times, long oppressed us sore. Many days they have lingered around our cabin door, but now we've brighter days in store. But now we've brighter days in store.
This is the site of Camp Floyd, the first federal military post in Utah. It was established in 1858 after a long, bitter standoff between Mormon and federal troops. It quickly grew to become the largest settlement in Utah outside of Salt Lake City. Its presence, even in this remote valley, was a constant reminder to Brigham Young that the federal government was sovereign in the territory. And to most Utahns at the time, it was seen as the last of a series of plagues visited upon them by enemies bent upon their destruction. In coming to the Great Basin, they'd hoped to distance themselves from American society. That very distance created serious problems of its own. And in the end, they found that the United States government, having let them leave, would not leave them alone.
'Tis the song, the sigh of the Mormons. Hard times, long oppressed us sore. Many days they have lingered around our cabin door, but now we've brighter days in store.
The decade had begun optimistically. The Mormons had successfully weathered a famine during the winter of 48-49. Visitors in the early 1850s were impressed with the thriving settlements. The Jesuit Father de Smet spoke of Utah in 1851.
We cannot say what in the way of colonization may not come to pass in a short time. After witnessing the success of the Mormons, who in less than 5 years have changed the face of a fight-filled desert and live there in great abundance.
Well, the good father may have exaggerated a bit, as he was wont to do, but it's nonetheless true that things looked pretty rosy in the early 1850s. In politics, the Mormons had not fared as well as they had hoped, but things could have been worse. By the time Brigham Young returned to the Great Basin from winter quarters in 1848, it was clear that the region would become United States territory. Early the next year, a provisional government called the State of Deseret was organized. The Deseret legislature met in July and decided to petition for statehood so as to gain the greatest possible autonomy for the territory. It was a vain hope. Congress was preoccupied with the seriously divisive question of slavery in the territories. Deseret's petition provided them a neat opportunity to balance the admission of California as a free state with that of New Mexico and Utah as territories having the local option of permitting slavery. A congressional committee named the new territory Utah after the Indian tribe, and President Millard Fillmore appointed Brigham Young governor and Indian commissioner. He filled the next 3 key posts with non-Utahns: Territorial Secretary B.D. Harris, Chief Justice Lemuel Brandebury, and Associate Justice Perry E. Brockus. Unfortunately, these appointees came to Utah expecting to control and profit from court, executive, and Indian office patronage. When these hopes were thwarted, they left, carrying to Washington an official complaint.
Almost all the entire population consists of a people called Mormons. The Mormon Church overshadows and controls the opinions, the actions, the property, and even the lives of its members.
The Mormons responded by singing merrily at their 4th of July celebration,
Lo, Utah's valleys now resound with freedom's tread on western ground. The raucous day in Brandaberry and Harris to the secretary have gone they went, but only when they left us. Have gone they went, they only of themselves bereft us.
The territorial legislature promptly gave the criminal jurisdiction once exercised by the runaway judges to the local probate courts. This was an unusual grant of judicial power to be of great consequence in the next 2 decades. Brigham Young felt so secure by the fall of 1852 that he asked Orson Pratt to announce publicly that the Mormons believed in and practiced polygamy. He defended plural marriage, as the Mormons called it, as a system socially and morally superior to monogamy. Though each season brought its share of challenges and problems, the good times continued until the summer of 1855. That summer, a long drought struck the flourishing territory. One resident described the state of affairs at the end of June.
There has been no rain of any amount, so that the drought is uncommonly great and the streams very low. There is not so much snow on the mountains now as there was last August.
To the drought was added an even worse plague, an infestation of grasshoppers and crickets.
Myriads of grasshoppers, like snowflakes in a storm, occasionally fill the air over this city, as far as the eye can reach, and they're liable to alight wherever they can distinguish good feed.
As the winter wore on, flour was so scarce that it could not be bought at any price. To his son, Heber C. Kimball wrote,
"Dollars and cents do not count now in these times, for they are the tightest that I have ever seen in the territory of Utah."
All these woes brightened the fires of the great Mormon Reformation, a period of intense soul-searching and recommitment to moral and religious teachings. The Reformation began in the little town of Kaysville in September 1856. Great crowds turned out for 3 days of fiery sermons led off by Jedediah M. Grant, a counselor in the First Presidency of the Mormon Church and mayor of Salt Lake City. At the end of the outpouring, 500 persons presented themselves for rebaptism, a symbol of their determination to reform their lives. From there, the Reformation spread out to every Mormon town and village. At special meetings, strong sermons were given urging adherence to Mormon dietary laws, taking of additional wives, observance of daily prayers, attendance at church meetings, and other evidences of renewed religious zeal.
Go in the outward church below, both wheat and tares together grow, and long will Jesus lead the crop, and pluck the tares in anger off.
To the modern eye, many of these sermons seem excessive and intolerant, particularly those that intimated that apostates might get into so vile a state of sinfulness that the voluntary shedding of their own blood could increase their chances for salvation. As in many similar Protestant reformations, the enthusiasm could not sustain itself for long. By spring, things had gotten pretty well back to normal. The whole episode was not without its lighter moments. After one session, Hannah Tapfield King confided to her diary her unhappiness when Jedediah M. Grant said there was an adulterous spirit in a literary club called the Philosophical Society.
Well, there may be, for he says there is, and probably he understands it. To me, it all seemed good and nice. Of course, a little vanity and folly in that. one sees in the tabernacle and everywhere.
National events were to have repercussions in Zion as well. Needless to say, Brigham Young's public announcement that Mormons practiced polygamy created a sensation in the Eastern press. By 1856, polygamy had become useful in the Republican Party's battle against slavery in the territories. That was the first year the Republican Party ran a candidate for national office. They hoped to broaden their appeal by insisting in their campaign rhetoric that Congress had the right to prohibit in the territories those twin relics of barbarism, polygamy and slavery. When the Democrat, James Buchanan, was elected, he was eager to show that though indulgent toward slavery, he certainly did not support polygamy. Events in Utah would give him an opportunity to make his point. During the winter and spring of 1856-57, a second set of territorial officials, federal carpetbag appointees, left Utah much as their predecessors had done in 1850. Chief among them was W. W. Drummond, an Associate Justice of the Utah Supreme Court. Convinced that the Mormons did not respect his authority as a federal official, Drummond left the territory and in March 1857 wrote a letter of resignation to President Buchanan, who had just taken office. He charged that the Mormons had burned court records, were defiant of authority, had a secret band to terrorize dissidents, and hearkened only to Brigham, who ruled in a dictatorial manner over the territory. He recommended that a new set of federal officials be appointed to replace Brigham Young and other territorial officers, and that an army be sent to install them. The charges were not wholly unfounded, but were distorted by Drummond's utter failure to understand the distinctive aspects of the Mormon character. How were the saints different? Mormons of the time sang a jingle.
For Mormons always vote one way, and soon a voice we'll get, and unison will bless the day that shines on Deseret. But never mention what we've said for this particular reason, that if you do, we're good as dead because you know it's treason.
Well, as this jingle clearly suggests, unity and consensus were the supreme social values of the Mormons. To them, their habit of always voting one way was simply evidence of a superior society. But to most Americans at the time, competition in getting votes was the only guarantee of an honest political process. The Mormon system in their eyes was, if not treasonous, certainly un-American. The problem was that neither group had the imagination to bridge that cultural gap separating Mormons from the rest of American society. President Buchanan, who was predisposed to action in any case, took the judge's report at face value and decided to follow Drummond's advice. He eventually found a Georgian, Alfred Cumming, who was willing to be governor. He then ordered the 10th Infantry Regiment to leave Fort Leavenworth, Kansas on July 18th. The commander, Colonel Albert S. Johnston, was not appointed until September 11th, when troops were already in the vicinity of Fort Laramie, nearly 700 miles ahead of him.
They say they'll send an army to set us Mormons right, regenerate all Utah and show us Christian light, release our wives and children and set us men to flight, for all our talking of Utah.
Mormons in the East had heard the news early in the summer and hastened west to warn Young of the government action. One party arrived late in July, finding the leading citizens, including Young, in Big Cottonwood Canyon celebrating the 10th anniversary of their arrival in the Salt Lake Valley. 2,500 people were picnicking, dancing, singing, and toasting the occasion when the writer's message was brought to Young. No announcement was made until that evening after the celebration was over. Though Young may have had intimations of the president's plans for some time, he had received no official notification of the purposes of the expedition. As territorial governor, he chose to see it as an invading force. He immediately began to mobilize the militia, the Nauvoo Legion as it was called, as well as the civilian population of the territory. He sent militiamen out on the plains to see to the safety of incoming Mormon immigrants and to spy on the federal troops. He called home colonists from outlying areas such as San Bernardino and Carson Valley, as well as all missionaries. He ordered fortification of Echo Canyon, the most defensible entry into Utah, remnants of which are still visible nearly 150 years later. Some Mormons, posing as immigrants, mingled with the troops, getting first-hand information as to the attitudes and intentions of the rank and file. The reports they brought back represented rank-and-file hostility more than government policy and fed Mormons suspicions that the Army planned to destroy them. Men of the Nauvoo Legion under Lot Smith conducted a persistent guerrilla war against the federal troops. Following Young's orders, they stampeded cattle and burned wagons in rangelands, employing any means possible short of bloodshed to delay the movement of the Army. Faced with the winter storms and depleted supplies, Johnston decided his troops would have to winter at Fort Bridger. The Legion had preceded them, however, burning all but the stone walls of the Mormon-owned fort and all the buildings of the settlement of nearby Fort Supply as well. His options at an end, Colonel Johnston established a winter camp nearby, which he named Camp Scott. The 2,500 men and officers and several hundred civilian camp followers settled down for a miserable winter on the plains. Only the colonel's vigorous leadership and a relief train from Santa Fe prevented disaster. In February, hopes for a happy outcome to the stalemate were raised when Colonel Thomas L. Kane arrived in the Salt Lake Valley from California as an unofficial negotiator. An old friend of the Mormons, he had made a daring journey by sea and across Panama, then overland from San Bernardino in an effort to avert a calamitous conflict. He encouraged Governor Cumming to come into the Salt Lake Valley under Mormon escort to meet Brigham Young. There Cumming was treated with respect and received as governor. He was amazed, however, to see a mass exodus underway as 30,000 men, women, and children carried out the evacuation of northern Utah in case the conflict was not peacefully resolved. While meeting in the William C. Stanus home, now known as the Devereaux Mansion, Governor Cumming and Brigham Young agreed that the troops could pass through the city on their way to a permanent campground 40 miles to the southwest in Cedar Valley. Young insisted that the city was to be empty, except for men appointed to fire the buildings if the soldiers made a move to molest homes or property. Kane, ill from his long journey, returned to the east, and Cumming returned to the army camps and awaited the arrival of peace commissioners who were to bring an official pardon to Brigham Young and those naughty Mormons, as one Mormon wrote in his diary. The Cumming party entered Salt Lake Valley on June 8th. Mrs. Cumming wrote of that occasion,
I thought there might be a reception, a small one, I knew, for the city was to be abandoned by its inhabitants until after the army had passed through. This had been agreed upon, but I was not prepared for the death-like stillness which existed. A large, beautiful city, the houses all separate, each with its garden-white streets, with a pebbly stream on each side. The gardens were full of flowers and vegetables and the promise of fruit, but the doors of all the houses closed, not a window to be seen, only boards instead, not a carriage, nor wagon, or mule, or horse, or man to be seen. On Saturday the 26th, the army passed through in excellent order, tired and dusty and hot, yet not a man nor a mule stepped out of place. They encamped about 2 miles beyond the city, at the Jordan. No wood, bad water, and little grass. Nothing to be bought in the city at all, for no one is here to sell.
Gradually, the Mormons returned to their homes and life returned to normal. Governor Cumming was trusted and respected by the Mormons. Camp Floyd came to be an economic bonanza for the Saints, providing them contracts for goods and services of all kinds. When it was abandoned in 1861 so the men could serve in the Civil War, some $4 million in surplus goods and improvements were sold to Utahns for a tiny fraction of their value. But the episode was by no means a Mormon victory. The sovereignty of the United States had been demonstrated. A large occupation army was now stationed in the territory. And even though the troops weren't visible in the Mormon towns, they were nonetheless just a day's march away. The Army made its presence felt in numerous confrontations over such matters as rangeland and water rights. And just a year after Camp Floyd was abandoned, Fort Douglas was established, this time right on the edge of Salt Lake City, keeping the Mormons fully aware of the federal presence from that time on. The Mormons at the time had a slogan that could be seen on the masthead of church publications and on placards in public places. "Mind your own business," it said. "Saints will observe this. All others ought to." Unhappily for the Mormons, the business they were about did not please most Americans of the time. They had been left alone for a brief 10 years in the Western Haven, but would never be left alone again. Americans of the time would not suffer a people different in values and aims to be tolerated, even if they lived 1,000 miles from the nearest town.
Come all ye sons of liberty, unto my rhyme give ear. 'Tis of a bloody massacre you presently shall hear. In splendor o'er the mountain some 30 wagons came, were awaited by a wicked crew, oh, Utah bears the blame.
The Mormon conflict left a legacy far more burdensome than just the presence of an occupying army. At the height of the tension, a group of Mormons and Indians in southern Utah fell upon a California-bound immigrant company at this spot and murdered 120 people. The only crime in the region exceeding it in magnitude was the Bear River Massacre of 1863, when federal troops under Colonel Patrick Connor attacked a camp of Shoshone Indians and killed 250. But the Mountain Meadows Massacre was far more sensational and is much better known even today because whites were the victims and were also among the perpetrators. In the fall of 1857, an immigrant company known as the Fancher Party began traveling through Utah along the southern route to California. It was a time of extreme tension, the Mormons fearing that the federal army on the plains intended to destroy them. The Utah settlements were on rations, saving food for whatever dislocation a war might cause. In the circumstances, they were distrustful of any strangers among them, refusing to sell them food and staying aloof. This angered the immigrants, and according to Juanita Brooks' careful study, the tensions created by the situation were made worse by the delicate relationship between the Indians and the Mormons in southern Utah. The Indians knew that there was tension between the Mormons and other whites, or Maracats as they called them, and were spoiling for a fight. The Mormons were anxious to placate them, hoping they would be allies if war broke out. They were also fearful of retribution by Indians on Mormon settlements if the Mormons were not cooperative, as the Indians greatly outnumbered the whites in southern Utah. The Fancher Party moved past nearly all the Mormon settlements and then camped here at Mountain Meadows, a favorite rest stop along the old Spanish Trail for people traveling to and from California since early in the century. The difficult Nevada deserts lay ahead of them. But when they tried to buy provisions at nearby towns, the settlers, under terms of martial law, refused to sell. Indians had been threatening to attack the company for days, claiming that they had poisoned the water holes the Indians' cattle drank from. Some of the Mormons had tried to pacify the Indians themselves with gifts of cattle. Fearing that the situation was getting out of hand, local church and militia leaders on September 6 sent an express rider to Salt Lake City to seek advice from Brigham Young. But the next day, the Indians attacked, laying siege to the encampment. Before the rider could return, the leaders decided that they must join with the Indians in assuring that the party would not reach California. Promising protection, they disarmed the immigrants, and then at a given signal, they turned on them, killing, together with the Indians, all but 17 small children. The rider arrived back at the scene 2 days later on September 13th, bearing instructions from Brigham Young that the immigrant party be allowed to go in peace. The massacre was reported to Young as an Indian depredation, and it was a year later before even he began to learn of white complicity in the matter. Even then, the first reports suggested that those involved had been forced to by the Indians at the peril of their lives. Fearing that all Mormons would be blamed for an isolated incident with terrible reprisals on the church, Young did not investigate the matter aggressively. He did urge the new governor Cumming to do so, but he refused on the grounds that the general amnesty granted by President Buchanan at the end of the Utah War would apply to any whites who might have been involved. As further evidence was brought to light, 3 local church leaders were excommunicated and others relieved of church positions. One was eventually brought to trial, and in 1877 executed at Mountain Meadows. The massacre continues to receive attention and discussion today, partly because of the many ambiguities involved. This wasn't a clear case of hot-blooded Americans riding out to stop petty thievery or Indian raids and indulging in overkill, as at Bear River. This was a much more complicated affair. And interest in the incident is sustained, I think, because Mormons were involved. Some who have written on the subject have claimed that it was the predictable consequence of an authoritarian system where obedience is more highly prized than individual conscience. Others have seen in it confirmation of the many tales rampant in the West of Danite terrorists or of blood atonement. And to the faithful Mormon, it must be a matter of grave concern, as it certainly was to Brigham Young, as he began to realize the full enormity of the crime. But it seems to me that the tragedy at Mountain Meadows was clearly an aberration from the usual Mormon response under pressure. From the time of Joseph Smith, church leaders had always taught that the faithful should be kind and patient and full of good works. And except for a brief time at far west Missouri, they had always exemplified these qualities, even in their most critical moments. At the murder of Joseph Smith, when inhabitants of the towns near Nauvoo were fleeing in terror, the Mormons possessed a disciplined and powerful militia, but they undertook no act of retribution. In numerous instances from that time until the present, they have suffered defamation of character, loss of property, and even of life, only to turn aside and attempt to build anew elsewhere. The Mountain Meadows Massacre was inconsistent with their teachings and with their acts as a people. How then could it have happened? Well, I think it happened mainly because in the heat of the moment, with pressures tightening in from many directions, a few men panicked. But even if the leaders could come to the misguided conclusion that they should kill the immigrants, they couldn't do it alone. How could they get the rank and file to assent to such a scheme? Some of the men involved at Mountain Meadows could not reconcile the act with their faith, and at the last moment fired in the air rather than to participate in such a deed. Had more taken the time to weigh the proposed action against the fundamental teachings of their religion, I doubt that it would have happened at all. But it also wouldn't have happened had not President Buchanan chosen without thorough investigation to send an army to Utah unannounced in 1857. And it probably wouldn't have happened had not the immigrants themselves chosen deliberately to provoke the Indians at a time when they were spoiling for a fight. It may not have happened had the treatment of the Mormons by Americans in Missouri and Illinois years before been different, or had the sermons of the Mormon leaders during the Reformation been less inflammatory. But it did happen, and pretending that it didn't won't make it go away. Events of the decade had shown that the Mormons would find no real isolation in the West, no Shangri-La where they would be left alone to work out their destiny. To drought, famine, war, and military occupation was added a burden of remorse made more painful because the acts that caused it went so utterly against the teachings of their faith and the known record of their conduct as a people.
Tis the song, the sigh of the Mormons. Hard times, long oppressed us sore. Many days they have lingered around our cabin door, but now we've brighter days in store. The grasshoppers, crickets, and mobbers all combined were powerless to crush our noble cause. The more we are hated, the more we are maligned, the more the Church of Jesus grows. 'Tis the song, the sigh of the Mormons. Hard times, long oppressed us sore. Many days they have lingered around our cabin door, but now we've brighter days in store. 'Tis the song, the sigh of the Mormons. Hard times, long oppressed us sore. Many days they have lingered around our cabin door, but now we've brighter days in store. But now we've brighter days in store.